Hi everyone, my name is Jackie. Today my topic is it better for the Canadian economy to move away from its historical ties with the US? Or should it keep its historical ties? My answer is yes. Canada should move away. Canada should develop trade with other countries and gradually get rid of its dependence on the single hegemony of the United States. And I will argue this from the Bretton Woods system and decolonization, US debts, and the US using its financial power for political control and gain. And I will also explain why these three things together show that Canada should break away from the United States. So my main argument is this. I think Canada should move away from the ties with US and engage with other nations because the US tariffs and the trade restriction are increasing costs and reversing the previous gains from the free trade and also pull down Canada's GDP growth. So I will make this argument from three sides. First is the Bretton Woods system and de-dollarization. Second, the US debts and the US using its financial power for political control and gain. And the third, I will show that Canada already has real option to move forward, like the CPTPP, CETA, and Canada's own natural resources, which give Canada a real bargaining chips at the table. So these 3 points together explain why Canada can actually break free from the US and develop like multilateral trade relationship and to change the future economic structure of Canada. So I will talk about some background about uh, the relationship between Canada and US. So these two countries has been communicating in free trade for 37 years. In 1989, Canada and the United States signed the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, also known as the CUSFTA, and then the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement was signed in 2020 to replace the NAFTA. The relationship and treaty between Canada and the United States ensured that most Canadian goods were duty-free and gave Canada privilege to trade access to US and Mexico. The treaty stabilized the Canadian market. But then in 2026, the United States broke the treaty and increased tariffs on Canada, causing the Canadian market to begin flu to fluctuate. This result in inflating operational costs, reducing manufacturing output, and causing job losses and other problems. So, because of this, and Tiff Macklin, the Bank of Canada governor said, I want you to really hear this. The era of rules-based open trade with United States is officially over. He also said that the US protectionism will permanently transfer Canada's economy forever. And this is why we need to talk about what comes next. The Bretton Woods system. So to understand why Canada is so tied to the US and why this is a problem, we need to go back to this system. In 1944, the exchange rate for all of the world currency was fixedly pegged to the US dollar. And the US dollar itself was equivalent to gold. So this means that all the currency from other countries, include Canada, cannot be directly exchanged for each other. So to be converted into US dollar and then exchange for the currency of other country. For example, if a Canadian travel to France in 1944, they have to use Canadian dollars to buy USD and then using USD to buy French dollars. So the US dollar has to be used as the main benchmark for international settlement, and every country, including Canada, had to go through all this to trade dollar, and it makes things really complex. So then in 1971, when United States faced the huge expenses of Vietnam War and the domestic economic recession, the decline in other country trust in the US dollar and led to the intensification of the exchange of gold. And everyone want to use dollars to change their gold back. And when the United States was unable to maintain the gold exchange and faced war, and the President Richard Nixon unilaterally ended the system in 1971 and imposed 10% tariff on foreign imports. And from this history, we can conclude whenever the United States face a huge war expenses or economic recessions, it will increase tariffs on input goods, import goods to increase tariff revenue so they can maintain their national expenses. So if country under US center system, the uni unilateral protectionism politics implemented by the United States to solve its own economic crisis will directly have a serious economic impact on the trading partner like Canada and other countries that are using US dollar. So, and we can see this happening right now. And the Trump US priority policy has been uh, dissatisfied with Canada's trade, its imbalance, and he tries to protect US local manufacturing like the steel, aluminum, and industry through tariff. So he also claims that if the Chinese product are used as a springboard to bypass US tariff, and Canada has no effectively to stop this product from entering US market. So the US said that if Canada reach a trade agreement with China, and the United States will impose 100% retaliatory tariffs to Canada. So it can be seen that a single dependence on the United States will treat the country unfairly and weaken the trade relationship with other countries. So even if the Bretton Woods system has collapsed its end, but the US dollar is still the preferred currency for global trade. And this gives the US a huge amount of power and control over other country and Canada. Even when Canada is not doing business with the US at all. And here is a real example. When a Canadian timber company sell wooden boards to French house builders, and the bank of the buyer and seller must settle in US dollar through the corresponding banks in the United States. And the US government claims that because these transfer of funds take place in US account and each transaction technically contests US territory. So, and this gives its legal jurisdiction and forcing foreign country to follow US laws on money laundering and corruption. So this means Canadian companies may still be sued by US even they follow the Canadian law. So the Canadian enterprise must also study the US sanction list known as the OFAC, the Anti-Money Laundering Regulation or AML, and the Anti-Corruption Act, and known as the FCPA. Even if the transaction has nothing to do with the United States, but it must be compliant as long as it's settled in US dollar. It has to follow every laws policy in the United States. And the most powerful example is the Meng Wanzhou incident in 2018. She's Huawei CEO's daughter was arrested in Canada by not for violating Canadian law, but for violating the US and sanction against Iran. The Canadian government had no choice in this matter because it had to follow with the legal jurisdiction and judicial intervention of the United States and was forced to cooperate with the judicial process of the United States for nearly like 3 years. And this is what it means to be trapped by dollar hegemony. Because of this, if Canada wants to develop a trade relationship with other country and being sensation by United States, such as Iran, Russia, China, and it is almost like impossible to move forward at the financial level, even if the Canadian government is politically willing to do that, but the Canadian bank will refuse to trade for fear of fines from the United States. And this greatly reduced Canada's diplomatic autonomy and makes it like so hard to participate participate in the trade diversification policy. So now we can talk about the US debt crisis and what it means for Canada. And the US Treasury has exceeded $35 trillion dollars, and the debts increased by $1 trillion dollars every 100 days. And the US government spent more money on interest than the entire defense budget. And because of this, the US is bound to print more banknotes to pay off these debts, and which also mean the US dollar is guaranteed to lose its purchasing power in the future. And if Canada continue to rely on trade with US dollar system, it will definitely suffer the shrinkage of wealth caused by the depreciation of the dollar. So how? And there are three ways, and it would directly hurt Canada. And the first is the shrinkage of foreign change. The Bank of Canada hold US dollar as for foreign exchange reserve. When the purchasing power of the US dollar goes down, and the real wealth of those reserves will just evaporate, and Canada will lose money without doing anything wrong. And second is it will make export income decrease because Canada's export to the United States, like oil, timber, are denominated in US dollars. So if the dollars continue to depreciate, the US dollars received by Canadian enterprise will become more and more worthless. So when they exchange back into Canadian dollars. So both timber merchants and oil companies in Canada will be directly damaged by the effect of depreciation of US dollars. So the third is import inflation. So when the US dollar depreciate and the price of global commodities will increase like oil, grains, metal, when they rise in US dollar, the price of Canadian imports will also increase. So the increase in the price of the import goods will eventually push up Canadian domestic inflation. And this will hurt everyday people in Canada, like buying grocery, uh, getting oil for the car, and not just big company, also for people in Canada. So now here is something important I want to talk. Canada is not powerless. The option to move forward is already here. And Canada already been actively laying out an alternative dollar structure and achieving some result. So Canada Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, is covered like 11 countries such as Singapore, New Zealand, Japan, and Australia. It provides a legal and institutional framework for Canadian dollar settlement. And also the UK officially joined the further expansion of the network in 2023 and making it even like the connection bigger. So on top of that, Canada has quietly replaced the status of US dollar in six countries like Indonesia, Kenya, Vietnamese, and UAE with the bilateral currency swap agreement and Canadian dollar settlement system. So the system of the settlement in Canada dollars with other country can avoid the legal jurisdiction and judicial interference brought about by the hegemony of the US dollar. They can just cut off the effect from using US dollar, like being charged for fine for like for affecting by the US policy, and it strengthens the policy of promoting trade diversification for Canada. And the CETA is also already there. It's a world-class natural resources and existing frameworks such as the thing I talk about like the CPTPP and CETA, and it's emerging bilateral monetary arrangements and provide a real basis for diversification. And there are not future plan, and Canada is already working on it, and it should be more and more connection to other country. So, and here is why countries will agree to trade with Canada on on Canada's own term, and because Canada has the resources needed by the world, like oil reserve are the third largest in the world, and the potash fertilizer export at about 31% of the global total. And Canada also has uranium, ore, and other import resources. And these are things other countries generally needed. So because of this, Canada has the real bargaining chips to say to its trader partner, they can just be like they are more inclined to settle this transaction with Canadian own currency or monetary arrangement agreed upon by both parties. And when Canada do this, Canada can directly create a demand for Canadian dollars. So the foreign buyers need to buy Canada dollars to purchase like oil and other stuff. And if the demand for the Canadian dollars increase, and the exchange rate will be more stable, and the import costs will also fall. And in addition, it can bypass US agent banks to avoid the US jurisdiction risks and reduce compliance costs, and transaction data will no longer flow through the Federal Reserve System from US. And settlement in Canadian dollars can directly make Canada immune to the impact of the depreciation of the US dollar. So to wrap up everything, Canada dependence on the United States on trade and dollar settlement and financial base has caused a struggle damage. So the repeat use of protectionism and the use of the dollar hegemony for the legal and political control in the US has made Canada economic continue to decline. And at the same time, Canada is not powerless. Its world-class natural resources and existing some frameworks such as the CPTPP and CETA and emerging bilateral bilateral monetary arrangement provide a real basis for diver diversification, and Canada must consistently to multilateral trade relationship and alternative financial to reduce its dependence on US, the like a single and unpredictable partner, and the area of passive dependence is over, and Canada economic diversification is no longer an option, is essential. So like what I say, I think Canada, it has to be get rid of US and engage with other nation. And that's my presentation. Thank you.